Okay, it looks like everyone who's coming is here. Thanks everyone so much. Good morning. My name is Pamela Robinson. I'm a professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning, and I am also the academic director at City Building TMU. I'm the moderator for today's session, and I'm really delighted to have you here. I want to start by beginning with a land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, and it's a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bounds them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all other newcomers have been invited into this treaty in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As urban planners, both professional and practicing, it's really important for us, I think, to think about our relationship with Indigenous communities and also in terms of our relationship with the land. The talk that my colleague Victor Perez-Amado is going to give today is very much in the spirit, I think, of rethinking the way in which planners work with community, to center their needs, to listen to their voices, and to work in a way that's more equitable and sustainable and fruitful for communities moving forward. And so when we share the land acknowledgement, we are very mindful of planning's colonialist past and the need to work and do things in a different way. I'm really excited that we get to welcome my colleague, Victor Perez-Amado, who's an assistant professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University, to join us today. For those of you who've never met Victor, he's got many talents and skills. He's an urban designer and a placemaker, and also an educator and a researcher on different forms of housing. And he's got a particular focus on looking at how seniors can live together in ways that allow them to have the kinds of communities that they want rather than the ones that we've chosen for them. We'll be talking to him today about the needs and interests of older adults in the Indigenous Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex community in Toronto, and how their housing needs are and aren't being met. Victor's research really focuses on how we can make changes to the urban fabric that we have to ensure that there are more housing opportunities for members of these communities moving forward. So before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I just want to let you know that Victor's going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes to answer questions from the audience. If you've got a question, we're going to invite you to use the question and answer function on Zoom. Maybe it's been a while since you've been on Zoom. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see two bubbles together with Q&A. That's where you can add your questions. And if there's a question that someone else has asked that you really like, you can upvote it. We're also recording this session. One of the things that we find is that after people come, they really would like to share. We'd encourage you to do the same because I think you're going to find this an engaging session. So we'll post this session on the City Building TMU website in the following days. And please make sure that you're a subscriber to our newsletter. We'll put a link in the chat in case you're not, about how to do that. Okay, so those are our housekeeping notes. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Victor Perez-Amado, who's an assistant professor in our school. I've talked a little bit about what he does, but here's a bit on Victor's training. Victor has a Master's of Architecture and a post-professional Master's of Architecture and Urban Design from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he graduated with distinction. Broadly speaking, Victor's research and teaching focus on research on aging in place, transformation of long-term care facilities, and multi-generational housing built on 7 years of practice and built work experience with innovative seniors projects across North America. He works in particular in collaboration with seniors with dementia, autism, and those also living with a mental and a physical disability. So Victor, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's all hear about your research.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Just 1 second. Can you see my screen? Perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm Victor Perez-Amado. I'm an assistant professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University, School of Urban and Regional Planning. Today, I'll be talking about our exploration of housing challenges of 2SLGBTQIA+ older adults in Toronto, which was also exhibited in the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism in South Korea in 2023. So this presentation will be based on 2 research papers that were currently in peer review and their design presentation used for the Biennale. But first, I would like to acknowledge our talented team and partners from the Toronto Metropolitan University, Vinaya Mani, Sam Casola, and from EGAL Canada, Dr. Celeste Pan, and the University of Toronto Centre for Landscape Research. For the first time ever, there are more people over the age of 65 in Toronto than under the age of 15. A population disparity the government of Canada will predict almost double by 2046. Much of Toronto's housing stock lacks diverse options, it's mostly classified as single-detached home and is defined as a yellow belt. Although older adults predictably live almost everywhere, projectors indicate that neighborhoods in the yellow belt, which are over here, will soon be predominantly occupied by people ages 65 and older. So we can observe in this map that the areas with higher concentration of older adults are the ones that are darker, and they are the ones that are the proper retrofitting in the next couple of years. Furthermore, in North America, most older adults do not live with their families nor age in place or in community. Most often, that large demographic segment of our population is placed in senior homes, very different from where I grew up in South America, supportive housing or long-term care facilities in the peripheries of cities. However, the rapid shift in Toronto's aging demographics causes difficulties to provide the needed supportive housing. So for example, in this map, we have 10 long-term care facilities around the city that are run by the City of Toronto. But as we see, that's not enough to house all the entire population that will soon age in the next 10, 20 years. Older adults who identify as 2SLGBTQI+, which stands for groups, Indigenous, Two-Spirits, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex, are particularly affected by the lack of age-inclusive housing. Limited information suggests that older adults may feel the need to hide their identity due to a lack of appropriate housing and fear of discrimination. Canada's housing policy should better consider the unique social structures of 2SLGBTQIA+ or the older adults who often rely on chosen families for support. And I put this photo because these are the type of housing that are currently being inhabited by this demographic in our city, because they are allowed for different types of cohabitation within them. These families are formed through non-biological relationships essential for support networks and informal caregiving. So to address these issues, new housing models and services are necessary in Toronto, including retrofitting strategies that align with principles of aging in place and aging in community. Aging in place is basically when someone makes a conscious decision to stay in the habitation of their choice for as long as you can. And aging in community means that you can go from different places. You can rotate, downsize, but you're still within your neighborhood, and you can maintain social networks. So based on these parameters, we wrote 2 papers, which are again in peer review, and we organized this exhibition in Seoul, which aim to understand the needs of Toronto's aging population with a focus on 2SLGBTQIA+ individuals and provide housing seating planners to support aging in place and aging in community. So the exhibition basically consisted on the back, we have the current conditions that are happening in the city, and then on the front, we have architectural, urban retrofits, and land policy use recommendations. So we examined 4 key factors in this. The current availability and conditions of housing, public realm services, and open space amenities in Toronto. And we do this with a series of research methods. First, we did an examination of policies to comprehend the land use regulations governing the built environment for 2SLGBTQI+ older adults. We conducted a photo analysis of case studies in Willowdale in this case, but just for the exhibition. We did an assessment of current 2SLGBTQIA+ geographies, dwellings, and living formations beyond the queer village in Toronto, using primary qualitative and spatial data, which was then normalized, geocoded using ArcGIS to create a series of overlay maps that I'll show you in a little bit. And then lastly, we identified gaps and proposed guidelines. First, it was important for us to understand the political structures and policies that got us to this point. So with this timeline that I'm showing here, we conducted a policy evaluation where we compiled various legislations and housing developments from back then in 1867. Basically, we analyzed Toronto's land use policy as it relates to the built form of housing. and then how federal, provincial, and municipal policies translated into prototypical assisted livings, where we see a link between the policy, directives, and advancements in the design and construction of these homes. So based on this study, we found several legislations that discriminate against 2SLGBTQ communities, which I will show you in a little bit, and also older adults, and also found out that, for example, retirement homes currently have a wait list of at least 3 years, each one of them in Toronto. So we also conducted a photo study to understand the housing options, public realm amenities, and open spaces. So for example, in this case, in the yellow belt, which are the top set of photos, is where housing is allowed. But in reality, all the amenities and housing for all the adults, because it's considered healthcare in the city, it's allowed in these areas, which tend to be bare, open, wide, 6-lane traffic lanes, which are not conducive to aging place nor in community in these places. We also conducted a map overlaid approach where we got different data layers from GIS to examine patterns, trends, and synergies between social configurations and housing options for the Rainbow community in Toronto, while also identifying social spatial connection between data layers. So for example, we identify housing with social services. And these maps reveal gaps in resource distribution, which tend normally to be in the Church Wesley area, in the queer village, and which are lacking, if you see this map, on the other underserved communities around the city. Notable gaps such as affordability challenges and limited mid-sized housing options were also identified in this gap. For example, this map illustrates the number of people residing in a single dwelling, the monthly rents, and the average rent per neighborhood. So cohabitation among 2SLGBTQ+ individuals is influenced by the desire to form kinship and social and chosen families, but it's also a way for to minimize the really expensive rents that are currently happening. And this tends to happen in single-detached housing rather than apartments, which is currently what we are building in this city. So these are the 3 main gaps that we identified in housing: lack of affordable housing, obviously, absence of purpose-built mid-sized housing typologies, which is extremely important for people that want to create these social networks. And absence of purpose-built apartments that support communal living is extremely important, especially because I'm going to talk a little bit about safety in our city for the 2SLGBTQ communities. Currently, there's a lot of violence happening in housing for these communities. So having a safe environment where these chosen families and these kinship relationships happen is extremely important. For policy gaps, we identified that housing policy in Canada takes a limited approach addressing specific family configurations outside the heteronormative standards, which means the typical of a mom and a dad and 2 kids, right? And then second, Toronto needs to enact legislations and programs that facilitate safe and affordable housing options for marginalized communities that could be for the LGBT community or could be for other communities that are equity deserving. So this exhibition from panels address micro-level changes for neighborhoods in Toronto. These panels display the student housing conditions. And then with a series of overlays, you can see what can happen if policy changes. So the proposed changes include housing retrofits, public realm improvements, enhanced services, open space amenities, and land use policy recommendations. Building, again, on our previous analysis, we visually represent architectural, urban design, and landscape recommendations, where we identify how to densify the city, what kind of transportation is needed, what kind of type of housing retrofits, and urban spaces. So for example, we go into more detail on housing typologies, where we incorporate some designs that are medium and small and medium scale. So these models integrate residential and shared amenities together, fostering kinship. In this case, type 1, we did purpose-built single-detached housing, where we create rooming, shared community spaces, and healthcare, which is extremely important again. And shared community spaces, because that creates a bonding and a way for mentorship between different members of the community. Another one that we created I thought that was really important was multi-generational rental. Older adults, for example, with students, we share community spaces and essential services. The multi-generational housing should encompass support services that address, again, mental health, identity development, offering with trauma-informed care approach. And furthermore, social support systems and opportunities for community development must be seamless integrated into this program. So as you see, this small-scale housing is really important because they are discrete and they allow for areas that can be basically tucked in and don't create targeting within this population. And then we continue by analyzing and providing recommendations for existing federal, provincial, and municipal policies that do not support aging in place or in community and are discriminatory for the LGBT groups. So for example, I will read this one. At the federal level, we have what we call multi-generational home renovation tax that allows families to build or renovate secondary units for older adults. However, eligibility requires familiar relationships based on genetics and blood ties, such as parents, grandparents, children, etc. This really is discriminatory towards the LGBT community who are trying to form these chosen families relationships and trying to age in place. And another one that is really interesting is this one. The Toronto right now, it's, as I mentioned, is the formed with the yellow belt that is 62% of the city and is formed in single detached housing. To address the type of shortage that we have, the City of Toronto enacted what is called expanding housing options in neighborhoods, which allows gentle densification, they said. But these developments are required to respect and reinforce the character of the city or the area. So it creates a really big boundary for people or their adults that would like to renew or renovate or create, let's say, a house that has several units for them to cohabitate in this area, because that will not be part of or respecting the characters of this area. So these are the types of small details that we need to see when creating equitable housing in this city. So then based on these typologies, catalog, and policy recommendations, we proposed new planning methods for Toronto's neighborhoods centered on principles of aging in community. So this is a graphic, what we presented in the exhibition. So that's the before and that's the after. And we approached this through architectural, creating innovative shared housing models. This is more of a building that we propose of this type of environments to age in place. But then also we achieve this by implementing urban design retrofits, transforming streets into environments that are not just single detached housing with the lawns and the typical picket fences, but to accommodate various types of programs that adhere to a more aging in community environment. So with small scale retail, pharmacies, etc., that are needed for people to be in one place. Again, these programs can include essential services, amenities, and socialization areas, which can be located within walking distances, as you can see here. So we provided within a house spaces for people to create, communal living spaces, shared housing, etc. And then in the same area, we proposed expanding the policy to allow for retail or small-scale retail and essential services. So in summary, this project has a threefold purpose, which is advancing aging in community, housing design discourse, and also emphasizing inclusion and equity, and providing data-driven to non-for-profit organizations such as EGAL, which I've been working on, and city entities, which is why we're doing these papers to show to the city that this is really important to change. So these efforts aim to foster, again, safe, supportive, and inclusive environments for 2SLGBTQI plus older adults in our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, for your presentation. So I have a few questions for you, but what I'm really going to do is just get us warmed up until members of our audience put their questions in the Q&A. We'd really like to hear from you and give you a chance to connect with Victor directly. So Victor, I think, the first thing I want to start with is, why do we still have to do this research now? in 2023, 24. Like what's taken, it's not you, but like what's taken decision makers and government so long to figure out, and like in a weird way, you shouldn't have to do this because people should be thinking about these community members already. So thoughts about why it's taken so long for us to start to recognize the needs of these community members?
Well, there are different things. I would say first, for older adults in general, the way that that housing for older adults as a whole is thought is not as housing but as healthcare, and it's thought as institutions, right? That creates a lot of money generation because most of them are privatized. As I showed, there are like 10 of them that are run by the city, right? So
Right.
that is one thing, right? That we are treating one segment of our population as disposable, and cash, different than how we treat these older adults in other parts of the world where they are the essence of our society, right? Where we respect them and we treat them and they stay at home with us until forever, right? But here we not, right? Here we treat them as if they were going to a emergency room, right? Which is long-term care or these senior facilities, as that's what we see even when COVID happened, the types of spaces that these people were treated, not even with dignity. So that's one part. And then for the LGBTQIA plus community, it's a very touchy subject. I think it's the lack of one, investment and care from the city into marginalized demographics in general, not only this one, but I would say for Black communities, for the LGBT community, for the Two-Spirit community, for the indigenous community, if we really want to create an area that is more equitable, the city would have done it. And I was having this conversation with a colleague of mine, even with homelessness, let's say. So the city, or the government of Ontario, if they care, they would do it the same way that they would do, I don't know, Ontario Place, right? Which they're investing millions, billions of dollars in there.
Right.
But because this is not a money generation of housing, it's not for them. It's not an important subject, right? So I think there's multiple factors, and then the last piece, the question, the $1 million questions that I always get. So why the 2SLGBT community? I was like, because it's part of the an equity deserving group. It's not only about this community, but this is an example of that we need to provide equitable housing. And once it's done for this group, it can be done for other groups at large, right? So this is just a small little grain of sand that's in collaboration that we can do to show that it's important for other communities as well.
I think that, flexibility and choice are two of the key factors in universal design. And I think one of the strengths of the research that you're doing is that what you're showing is that if we focus on the needs of these community members, we're all going to benefit, right? I mean, if we brought the approach that you're suggesting into the zoning bylaw, that flexibility would serve all kinds of other community members well too, beyond the 2SLGBTQI community members as well, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so question for you, and this may be a little bit outside your scope because you're a designer, but we know we have a housing affordability crisis in this city and in this country right now. How much is the struggle to find affordable housing making what you're proposing even harder to do you think? Because there's more competition for places, there's greater pressure on single family homes, for example. We see with our colleague Jushi Zhuang, who's doing research on international students in housing, that's a different kind of housing pressure. But what's the connection between the housing affordability crisis and the work that you're doing right now?
Well, as I showed, the areas that are called yellow belt, right? They're mostly single detached housing. And already the city understands that this is what maybe needs to be retrofitted, right? But still they're very polite in the way that the policy is being implemented to say, okay, well, we can retrofit a house, but it needs to still be parts or show respect to the character of the area, right? So if a neighborhood has $1 million house, right? The last thing that they want to do is create rooming housing within this place, right? Or create a place where, let's say, cohabitation of 10 people happen, because they want to maintain the integrity of that neighborhood. So a lot tends to fall back into what it's allowed or in that area, right? So that's one thing. The way that I'm thinking about this research, for example, is a lot of older adults in this area as well are house rich but cash poor, right?
Right.
Where they live in these really big houses, but then they barely have money to like pay for food, right? On their own food stamps. So it is really important for them to have the option of like maybe downsizing or these houses to be retrofitted. So one of the ideas that we had is like, why not doing a multi-generational type of housing where we have, students benefiting from cheaper housing with older adults that are from the LGBT community, and then you have older adults who might benefit from them because they're going through maybe loneliness and cutoffs of social networks, right? So that symbiotic relationship could happen, right?
Yeah, and it's another example of, if we're flexible and creative and welcoming, we can create better housing conditions for so many more people. Okay, we've got a really good question from Ed McDonnell in the chat. He writes, I really appreciate the thoughtful assessment of these unique needs. We hear a lot from the province about housing supply, but not supply mix that maps onto our aging population, unique ethnocultural communities and young people, etc. Do you see bright spots or leaders that should be emulated and highlighted in certain municipalities or community-based initiatives?
Say that. Can you read the last part of the question again?
Do you see any examples of best practice, or is anybody leading the way that you've come across? I mean, you took this research to the Seoul Biennale, right? So you had international spotlight.
Yeah.
Who's got this right? Who can we learn from?
I know that in Toronto, not so much. I'm gonna be honest. We're doing right now case studies in the city, and nothing is really happening for these communities. In the Seoul Biennale, that's why they invited to participate, because this conversation isn't happening there either, and they wanted to show the government how inclusive housing needs to happen in the country. However, in other places, let's say in Boston, I have colleagues that are already working and creating this type of communal living arrangements where there are older adults with students, for example. And that's how they can bring down the prices. Other places that are really important, for example, are in the, not surprisingly, in the Scandinavian countries, right? Where they are creating units where, for example, for dementia, or they're creating units where people can cohabitate within different housing. So not so much in Canada, but in the US, in a couple of places like Boston. And then we have, Scandinavian countries. Pamela, you are muted.
Would you like to talk at all about the studio, Victor, that you've got happening this semester in collaboration with community partners and students at the School of Urban and Regional Planning?
Yeah, sure. So I was waiting for that question. So as part of the continuation of this research, one important aspect is to understand the needs of actual real people, right? And the experiences. So we are partnering with EGAL Canada again, Dr. Celeste Pan, Mount Royal University, Dr. Celeste Pan, and Dr. Brittany Jakovic. And our students are conducting research with focus groups with real people in Toronto, Calgary, and Charlottetown to understand the different experiences and housing needs of these three cities. Why the three cities? Because they are big, metropolis in different parts of Canada, right? With totally different social conditions, housing, prices, and everything. But the experiences and stories that we have been hearing so far are pretty similar. And that's just like a little pilot project that we are doing right now with these communities, that then we are planning with EGAL Canada to make at a larger scale to really get a big pool of data from these communities and proposed change, basically.
That's great. Okay, we have another question from the audience. This is from Todd Smith, who thanks you for the presentation. Todd's curious to know, what are your thoughts about the co-op housing model, and is this something that we should revive for our communities in Canada?
Uh, well, co-op housing is a bit different than communal living, right? Because co-op, you need to basically just share property between all these community members, right? So it becomes a little more difficult to create these types of environments in our cities. Communal living, I would say rental type of apartments, it's a bit easier to create these environments, especially because this community is very fluid, right? It comes and goes. These relationships, you might have 11 people in a one house or 6 people. These people might live, right? Co-op is a really big commitment, right? Between
Right.
this. And you need, as Pamela has been saying, flexibility for the fluid relationships that happen within this community. So I think more rental with different types of environments and social spaces that promote this, it's a bit more useful.
It's interesting, I think, Victor, if we plot housing options on a time scale and you think about age at the same time, co-op might work better for people through the arc of their life when they're younger because there's stability of tenure because you have shared
Exactly.
ownership. Whereas as you age, as you noted, sometimes people's biggest investment, if they're fortunate enough to have one, is their house. And so
Yeah.
renting, if you're not owning the place you're living in and you're renting other, it may be more affordable, or you may
Right.
need access to money faster than the co-op model might allow you to have. And so
Exactly.
I think one of the things I heard you say is that this isn't a one size fits all solution, but what we need to do is bring a whole toolkit of options, of which co-op might be one,
Yeah.
but there isn't really one magic piece, right?
Exactly.
You know, it's so interesting to me that um that people, we haven't figured this out faster. I mean, when I was in planning school, we had Avi Friedman out of Montreal with his design for the Grow Home, which was this townhouse development that was designed to make it bigger or smaller vertically so that you could start with one of 3 floors. It was designed so you could add the second floor, add the third floor, sell one off, close the staircase off. Like, you'd think that we could be more flexible because and especially now with this new rise of modular and prefab design,
Right.
do you think we'll see, like, are you optimistic design wise that we may have new options that we didn't have before?
Um, I mean, from that type of building that you're mentioning, it is a bit complicated
Yeah.
architecturally to change and very closely related to change structures and
Yeah.
stairs within a building. So that kind of flexibility, I don't see it. Where I see flexibility, it's in again, it's providing the actual policy within the city for this smaller scale houses to be retrofitted however people want. That could be one
Right.
possibility. I'm optimistic in this for the next years. But I'm optimistic that change could happen within this yellow belt, for example, because if we don't have change in the next, I don't know, 20 years, we might not have enough housing in the city. So hopefully,
Yeah.
but what we are building right now is not good for that change.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, like, those kinds of new design things are great if you're
Right.
building new, but in a city like ours where we have so much space that needs to be retrofitted to be used better, they're not going to be design solutions that are
Right.
going to work very well. It really strikes me that, one of the parts that's hard about this is that when we only think about housing as an asset and we don't look at housing through a human rights lens, we're making it so much harder for people to have basic access to the things that they need, right?
Yeah.
And it really, we shouldn't be making people have to fight so hard to have access. The idea, for example, that the federal government has made blood relationship part of a piece of policy seems remarkably outdated, but
Yeah.
also it wouldn't be that hard to fix,
Yeah.
right? So I think, yeah. Okay, we have 2 more questions from the audience that I want to get to. Um, Okay. Oh, someone was wondering about just changing the color so that you could see the slides a little bit better.
Oh, sorry.
And here's a question for them. Do you find that there's a correlation between the need for housing for older members of the queer community and the specific need for affordable housing? When it comes to discrimination in the workforce in the past, especially, people in the community are not always able to fully participate and have more limited finances than in older years. Have you seen them impacted more disproportionately in the current housing crisis?
So affordability with older adults from the
Who are
2SLGBT
queer,
community.
yeah, or in the
We're
rainbow
queer.
community, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, research has shown that that's most of the queer community live on lower income than the heteronormative standards, right? So yes, affordability is a big piece of the equation for this type of communities. For equity deserving groups in general, not only for
Right.
the 2SLGBT communities. Why is that? Because some jobs might not even discriminate you just because of like your sexual orientation or identity, especially now, especially for trans communities. That's a big piece. So this type of affordability and safety within this environment is critical. Let's say for another example, affordability for older adults that are going through again identity transformation, and they might have, I don't know, a chronic disease, right? Which is some of the comments that I've had in our focus groups. A lot of the help the government gives do not support this, right? So these people end up being in like housing that tends to be, religious oriented because they have no options. They have to go back to the closet because the typical housing is not affordable. So it's a vicious cycle, right, that we have in our city. That if you can afford it, you're part of the LGBT community, good. But other minorities, especially minorities within the LGBT community, let's say BIPOC communities within the LGBT community, they even have it even harder because research has shown that these people have even lower incomes than other areas. So affordability is key. And then just to, again, emphasize the importance of affordability and safety, 2 days ago, 2 members of the queer community, Black community, were just killed in the western neighborhood of Toronto while walking outside. So that shows you how important safety and environments that are conducive for these relationships and support are extremely important.
So Victor, there's a question in the chat that asks about the tension between having enough critical mass of folks with similar interests and needs together in a cluster, or this person uses the word enclave, versus encouraging distribution across the city. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yes. So clusters in the city can happen when there's a bit more safety. Then clusters don't happen naturally, right? They tend to happen in areas where housing tends to be more affordable, when people find others that are that they feel relationships with them. It could be by ethnic type of background. Like, for example, if I'm Hispanic, I will look for that type of relationships with other peoples of the community. So those clusters can happen, but then tend to happen in a more discreet way, right? I think it's also important to embrace these relationships in parts of the city that tend to be more affordable outside the downtown core, if that's also the question. But those areas need to be, again, a little bit more, again, humble and discreet to avoid targeting. So clusters might not be the correct way of doing it because you don't want to call attention in that sense, right? And also clusters, just for everyone to understand, it's not that you have everyone concentrated like the village in Toronto, but it could be, for example, a building type in one, another building type, right? So there's kind of a network between all of them, maybe a community center that is friendly to the LGBT community, etc., right? To create like the actual environments for these people to feel safe in that. Yeah.
It seems to me too, Victor, and we'll maybe just end on this point, that ultimately what we want to do is have a city where people can choose where they want to live,
Yeah,
right? And so sometimes the clusters emerge because the service that people need access to, whether those are commercial services like grocery stores or access to doctors or access to other community supports exist there, or access to transit. But not everybody wants, people should have the right to choose where they live,
yeah,
right? And so what we need is, I think, a more universal provision of the kinds of opportunities that people would like to have access to
yeah.
and the kinds of built form, as you note, so that people can actually have the housing they want and they need, right?
Can I add to that, Pamela?
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
all, also from the stories that we have heard in focus group, not everyone, not all members of the LGBT community wants to be in a full cluster with other people. Some people might be shy and they just want to have a
Yeah.
couple of their chosen family and have that little cluster with them. But not everyone
Yeah.
wants to be in the middle of the village with right? So as you said,
Yeah.
flexibility and safety and comfort within the city is a key important factor. Not everyone wants to be in downtown. Some people might want to be more outside, right, of the city.
Right. Okay, I'm sneaking one more question, Victor. I lied. Okay. Have you seen any trends of different queer subcommunities seeking their own spaces and mingling in spaces that are aging supportive? For example, separate safe trans space versus gay male cis housing or together?
Can you repeat the question again, Pamela?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Have you seen any trends of different queer subcommunities seeking their own spaces versus mingling in spaces that are aging supportive?
Housing that are supported for older adults that are not specifically for those type of communities. Yes. So again, from stories, um, these type of communities or social networks tend to happen in like the in houses where one person owns the house, right? And then they have several rooms and then they rent the rooms and they become really close friends, or they bring their friends to live with them within this community. So they're not well, I mean, technically that is not really how it works in the city, policy wise, but that's how those relationships happen in the city. There's this really good book that's called How Toronto Became Queer, that shows stories, and those type of relationships tend to happen again in housing, detached housing that are again discrete and not again in full older adults type of environments, right? Not everyone wants to live in a healthcare type of place, right?
Right,
People want to age at home, age in communities. So this is
right.
where, and you bring your own people and peers with you, right? As comradeship. So yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen it, but it's again within those small pockets in the city.
Yeah. Okay, Victor, we're at time. One of the last comments that kind of came in at the end was about the importance of the need to do this research in Ontario and not just to look elsewhere for other models. And so, on that note, I want to thank you to you and your colleagues for doing this research. It's important work. It clearly has the potential to change people's lives. But most importantly, what you're doing is making recommendations that will lead to change at scale so that it can improve conditions for more people across communities in Ontario and beyond, because this work is vital and fundamentally important. I really want to thank everyone who came today. I want to thank the folks who asked questions. And I also want to thank the folks who are listening. This session is being recorded, and so we'll put this session up on the City Building TMU website. We encourage you to share it with anyone. And Victor's contact information is also available when it gets posted. And so if you see an opportunity to partner, or if you're a developer, for example, and you really feel like this is work that you can bring into a new development related project, we'd really encourage you to reach out to Victor. And Victor, when his work is published, will be able to share it widely too. Right,
I will.
Victor?
Yes, I will, of
Yeah,
course.
that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We wish you well. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank
Thanks.
you.